It was a typical Friday after my college classes were out, and I was spending the night doing DoorDash. This was my regular routine, dashing on the weekends to help me pay for all my living expenses while on campus. The night started well, getting a lot of orders done and making a good amount, and then it hit a stalemate after the big dinner rush. Very few orders were showing up, and the ones that did, they were very low paying, basically waste of time orders. But then after an hour of aimlessly driving around, an order came through that wasn't too bad. It was 8 miles away, but the payment was well worth it. It was nothing absurd, but enough to make it not a ripoff like a lot of the other ones were. I accepted the order and ran into the restaurant to grab the bag, then hopped in my car and started driving. The map said it would take 30 minutes, which I think was the longest of any orders I'd done up until this point. Most of the houses were right around campus, because any further than 15 to 20 minutes out, it becomes pretty much just bare fields of grass. As I got to that 20-minute mark, it became just that. Very few houses, mostly sitting far out in fields of crops, and nothing else. The rest of the 10-minute drive was on this empty road going along these farms. Then I made it to the house. There was a dirt driveway connecting to the road, leading through a large field, and in the far back was a small house. Driving through the field felt very eerie. Even though I'm not one to get nervous without reason, this felt different. As I got further out from the road, the only sound was the low rumbling of my car on the dirt. I parked out front and got the bag ready, then left the car on as I stepped out. The night was quiet and the house was dark, having only the porch light on to illuminate the outside. I walked through the unkempt grass and up to the porch, knocking on the door. As I waited, I looked back at my car, sitting in the dark, with the field of pitch black behind it. A moment went by, then I knocked again, but there was no response, not even the sound of anyone inside. It didn't take long for me to realize the strangeness of the situation, seeing no lights on in the windows and noticing how decayed the house looked up close. The only thing that made me think it couldn't be abandoned was that I had an order for this address, and the porch light was on. I looked at the light, thinking why would that be the only light? But by some odd chance, I happened to recognize the top portion of the casing having a cheap solar battery. It was just an automatic light that charges during the day and turns on in the evening, meaning nobody had to be here to turn it on. Just as I was piecing this all together though, I heard a rumbling sound behind me. I turned, seeing a car driving down the dirt path and coming up right behind my car. I stood there and stared at their headlights until a man stepped out. I yelled from the porch, asking if this was his order, but he didn't reply. He just stood right next to his car and didn't move or speak. I felt my adrenaline spike as I began realizing how horrible the situation likely was. The silence of the night only reminded me that there was nobody here to help. I was stuck in the middle of a field between an empty house and a stranger. In a split-second instinctual reaction, I dropped the bag and sprinted off the porch, running behind the house and straight into the field of grass. I looked back, seeing the man coming up behind me. Frantically, I continued running, and the further out I got, the thicker and taller the grass became, until it was covering all views of direction. By then, I knew the guy had no chance in following me. I slowed down, catching my breath as I carefully moved through the crops and tried to be quiet in case the man was still trying to find me. Eventually, I made it to someone else's yard, and from there I got to a road where I had enough signal to call for help. Police picked me up and went to check on my car, but of course, the man was gone by then. I was surprised though, because my car hadn't been looted, and the bag of food was still on the porch of the abandoned house. But that could only mean that the man had other intentions, likely far worse than just robbing me. This happened when I was 18, making the road trip from my hometown to my new college. I had all my stuff shoved into the trunk and backseat of my cheap SUV. This was not only my first long road trip alone, but was also going to be my first time being away from my family for an extended amount of time, so my nerves were reasonably high. Anyway, the directions I was taking said it was 600 miles total, which I split into 2 days of driving. I was taking whatever route the maps had me take, and it estimated I'd make it to the hotel at 11 p.m., but with possible traffic, gas stops, and getting food, I knew I'd likely get there much later. By 7, the sun was fully gone, and most of the cars were gone too. Every once in a while a car would pass by, and I'd see their headlights slowly fade out in front of me, but for most of the drive, it was just me. This actually made me really tired and bored. Around 10, I decided I'd stop at the next gas station before making the final stretch of the drive. About 10 minutes later, I exited the road and entered a gas station. Being so far out, this wasn't a town or anything. It was literally just a gas station with a few pumps and a tiny convenience store. I didn't see any other cars on the road or in the lot, and not even any lights from any nearby houses or buildings in the distance. I pulled right up to a pump and got out to start topping off my tank, and as I looked around, I almost got jump scared by a guy walking up to me. In comparison to myself, he was much older, probably 50s if I had to guess, and he honestly looked homeless. But regardless, being approached out here wasn't something I was expecting, and his short smile didn't make me feel any more comfortable.
"Hi, do you need something?"
I said, hoping he wouldn't walk any closer. The man stopped a few feet from my car and looked around almost cautiously before responding.
"Take the exit back onto the highway."
I looked at him confused, not sure if I was understanding him right. He pointed behind me at the exit I came from and repeated himself.
"Take the exit back onto the highway."
After a second, I said okay, and the man walked off, but I was still really confused. The exit I came from that he wanted me to take again was a one-way road, so by his logic, he wanted me to drive on the wrong side of the road and do a U-turn back onto the highway. It just didn't make any sense. I looked out at the entrance road, the obvious one that I was supposed to take, and there were no signs of any construction or anything blocking it. It just looked like an empty ramp back onto the highway. As I put the pump back and got in my car, I glanced over at the man, who was now just sitting against the side of the convenience store. The more I thought about it though, the more crazy that man seemed, just to be sitting out here saying nonsense. I thought maybe this was some kind of trap or something, so I went with my instinct and drove out of the lot and toward the entrance to the highway. As I merged onto it though, I realized pretty much all the streetlights were out. I slowed down, thinking maybe this was a construction zone or something. I kept my eyes focused on the road directly ahead, making sure to be cautious of anything. But while I made my way through the unlit road, I saw only a brief outline of a figure to my left before a pickup truck came out of nowhere and stopped right in front of my car. Every door opened as 4 men jumped out of the truck and started running up to my car. holding weapons of all kinds. Metal bats, machetes, knives, and not even anything covering their faces. They just had this emotionless gaze, like they felt nothing of what they were doing. I quickly started backing up as they got just a few feet away from my windows, and once I got far enough back, I suddenly saw the outline of dozens of people coming out of the shadows off the side of the road. A few even tried chasing my car as I frantically reversed out of there. As soon as I could, I turned around and sped off. I called 911 once I felt I was safe, but for some reason, I never got a call back. No update on it at all, almost like they didn't even check on it. Ironically though, it was the creepy old guy at the gas station that tried to prevent me from even getting caught up in that mess. Or at least that was what I assume he was doing. Either way, I was incredibly lucky to get out of that with my life, as I have no idea what that was or what they were all planning to do. I was delivering a truckload to a company on the far west coast, coming from the east coast. The route across the country is one I've taken many times before, being a truck driver for almost 20 years. It's always the same every time I make one of these drives. Same roads, same truck stops, and same everything. Over these 20 years though, I've never really had anything crazy happen. I've had a few odd scenarios, but they'd never amounted to anything. So when I was driving this route again, I had no worries in my mind. It was just another day on the job. About 20 hours into the route, a storm started coming over and slowing down my driving. It was late too, so by then I was already looking for the next truck stop to sleep at. As I drove though, a very sudden light appeared behind me. The road I was on was flat and straight, so I would have seen them coming in my mirror, but it was all of a sudden that they were right behind me. Maybe they had just turned on their lights or something. I didn't know, but they very quickly came right up to the back. I kept my eyes on them until they got so close that they were completely covered by the trailer. All I could see were their headlights reflecting off the back. But then their lights shut off. I maintained my speed and kept looking back at my mirrors, trying to see if they were still behind me, but I had no way to know. For someone to turn off their lights in the middle of a heavy storm was insane though, and to be tailing behind me so close was just as insane. Thankfully, a sign showed a truck stop was only 5 miles ahead, so at least I knew I was close to getting away from whatever this was. I didn't want to jump to conclusions based on just some weird behavior, but as a trucker, it's hard not to think about the possibility of it being an attempted robbery, especially when alone on the road at night. For the rest of the 5 miles, I saw no signs of them behind me. I was still on edge because I couldn't really see anything anyway, but I started feeling less worried as I was coming in on the truck stop. I pulled in, trying to check my mirrors to see if they followed, but with the rain and lack of lighting, it was really too hard to tell. The truck stop was mostly empty though, aside from a few trucks at the gas pumps. I pulled off to the side and parked in the middle of the lot. After waiting a minute and getting some of my stuff organized, I opened the truck door and leaned my head out, looking along the side of the trailer. I was drenched from the rain in just a matter of seconds, but from what I could tell, there was no car behind me. I closed the door and finally felt a bit of relief, grabbing my pillow and blanket from the passenger side. I locked the doors, turned off the truck, and tried to get some shut-eye. The rain pounding on the metal roof made it easy to fall asleep. blocking out any possible sounds coming from other trucks pulling in and out. When I woke up, though, I felt I had only been asleep for a few minutes. I looked around, seeing it was still dark out and the storm was the same, if not worse. But before I could check my mirrors, a loud thump shook the truck. My eyes opened wider. I reached for the door handle and opened it, looking out at the back of the trailer. Through the rain, I could barely see the outline of a car with its headlights off and two men moving around in front of it. Terrified, I hesitated to step out and confront them, and as I sat there in that moment of hesitation, the door suddenly slammed against my body, shoving me back further into the driver's seat. Another man stood outside, yelling at me to stay where I was, then slamming the door again. His right hand was shoved in his hoodie, and with two other men behind the truck, I was in no position to try anything. I could feel the truck shake as I just sat in place with the guy outside my door watching my every move. He didn't even look away for a second. This went on for a few minutes, then they ran back to their car and drove off. I was still in shock, watching their car disappear onto the road. I called the police and put in a report, but no information ever came up on who the men were. All I know is that if I had been any less aware, and had just tried to drive off at first sight of the men, I probably wouldn't have been able to make it out as safely as I did. Sometime last year, I was holed up in my house for a whole day and night. My city had a huge storm come through that put everyone on lockdown inside for almost an entire 24 hours. Houses and roads were flooding, and on the news there were even reports of wind damaging windows and ripping roof panels off of homes. I was alone at the time, spending the day on my phone, keeping up with the news and just listening to the chaos going on outside. Around 5 or 6, the power started flickering, turning off for just a few moments, then turning back on. Then, maybe just an hour after this had started, the power fully shut off. I waited for a few minutes, expecting it to come back on, but after a while, I realized it probably wasn't going to come back until after the storm was over. I sat on the couch and started scrolling through the news again on my phone for any updates, until there was a heavy knock on the front door. It scared me, being so loud in the midst of such a crazy storm, but also because I was not expecting anyone to be outside in this weather. I stayed where I was for a minute, debating whether to even see who it was, but then the thought rolled through my mind that maybe it was just a neighbor needing help or wanting to ask if my power was out too. It was still absurd for anyone to be outside, but I went up to the door and looked out the peephole. Nobody was there. Perhaps I'd waited too long to check, but looking out, a really unnerving feeling came over me. I went back to the living room and opened a window, letting the minimal amount of light in from outside. I didn't have any way to charge my phone, and I didn't have a flashlight, so I kind of just sat there and stared out the window. Then, out of the blue, I swear I heard a voice outside. I swung my head around behind me, looking toward where I thought I'd heard it from, but of course, I couldn't hear it anymore. I waited again, but figured it had to have just been the wind making strange noises, so I turned back around. Almost right on cue though, I heard it again. Just a quick few words, like someone was talking to someone else. I got up and went to a nearby window, looking out. It was so dark and rainy, there was nothing really for me to see. Still, I stared out into the rain, and a sudden flicker of lightning lit up the area for a second. and in that second, I made out a figure not far from my house. I had no way to know what he was doing, or really anything at all. I just saw a figure for a split second, and now that it was dark again, I couldn't see anything. Getting more unnerved, I closed up the windows and decided to go upstairs to the bedroom. Despite this, I was still nervous about the knocking and the guy I saw standing out in the middle of such a brutal storm. It was hard not to wonder what they were doing or who they were talking to. Hours went by with nothing more happening, just the sound of the storm outside as I sat in the room. Then, just when I had started to forget about it all, a sudden sound faintly echoed from downstairs. It was a door opening. I could feel my face go pale as I tried to listen, but it almost felt like the storm had grown louder, and I knew there would be no way I could hear any footsteps at all. I just had to sit there in my own thoughts and wait, horrified in the small, barely lit bedroom. A minute passed, and then another, and eventually I got the courage to call 911, though I knew it'd be a long time for them to arrive. From the time I heard the door open to the time the police showed up, it had been over 30 minutes, and yet there were no other sounds, and nobody ever came up to the room I was in. All the cops found was an open front door and wet shoe prints inside the house. There were no indications of any intent after entering my home. It almost seemed like they broke in, looked around for a minute, then just left. To this day, there's been no answers to the events of that night. This was almost 5 years ago from today. At the time, I was living in a small one-bedroom apartment when my parents bought a new house about an hour from the city I lived in. It was a really nice, way too big, countryside home with a ton of land. But due to their work schedules and just how complicated moving long distance was, they had to ship all of their stuff and have movers drop it off about a week before they would get there. To help out, I offered to house sit during that in-between time and make sure the move was all good. I got to the house on Saturday morning, greeting the movers and letting them haul everything inside, and they finished by sundown. All the stuff was piled in the corner of the rooms, with really just the couch set up for me to chill on. Seeing the house with everything inside, though, really put into perspective how large the place was. I mean, to me at least, it felt like a mansion. Huge, wide-open rooms with long, empty hallways. Without anything else set up, it was kind of unsettling. After eating some leftover dinner that I'd brought with, I decided to check out the backyard. It had a large patio with a fire pit built in, and had a bunch of random outdoor furniture scattered along the side of the house. I grabbed a small lawn chair and put it by the fire pit, then sat back and relaxed. The night was a little breezy, especially way out in the middle of the open fields, but it was really quiet and peaceful. It was probably around 11, and I was out there for at least an hour or so, when just out of nowhere, a man appeared in the distance. He was walking way out in the field. I looked to where he came from and saw nothing but open land. Then I looked toward where he was heading and saw the same thing. I watched this man walk all the way down until the fog covered him up, but the whole time I had no clue what he was doing out there. Several minutes went by as I looked out into the fog, still just thinking about this man, when again he emerged from the dark, this time walking the way he had come before. He was slightly closer this time as well, enough to where it was a little uncomforting. I ended up going back inside, not wanting to be seen. I stayed in for an hour, mostly scrolling on my phone, but also checking the windows a couple of times and not seeing anything of concern. Around 12:30, I grabbed a blanket from one of the boxes and tossed it on the couch, laying down and falling asleep in the middle of the living room. When I woke up, something immediately felt off. I was confused and uneasy, opening my eyes and trying to figure out why I'd woken up and why I felt like this. The whole house was dark and silent, and the shadows of the random stacked up boxes made it difficult to see. But only a moment after looking around, a bright glare shined into the room. I squinted from the brightness as the light moved around the room, then suddenly shifted away. Opening my eyes again, I saw another small glare moving outside the front window. Then it suddenly shifted again, coming through the window, lighting up the whole living room and directly shining into my eyes. By the time my eyes adjusted, the light was gone and the window had nothing behind it. I got up and picked up my phone as I went up to the window and tried to see who was out there, but they were long gone, having turned their light off and faded out into the foggy night. I don't know who was out there or what they wanted, but I'd say my best guess is that they had seen the movers and were trying to rob the place. Whatever it was though, I think I got lucky, because if I hadn't woken up from the light, it's likely I would have had to find out their intentions the hard way. It was just a regular Friday night after getting out of a long closing shift at work. I made a quick microwave meal, then hopped online with some of my buddies and started gaming. I had an energy drink and some snacks and was ready to stay up late and enjoy the night. We gamed for a while. I never even checked the time, but at some point there was a knock. At first I just told my friends to hold on as I took my headset off and stood up. But when I turned around from my desk, I realized how dark it was inside and outside, seeing only the light from my computer. I stood there, understanding now how completely out of the norm it was for someone to be at my door this late into the night, and that's when I saw a man looking at me through the window. I froze when I saw him, feeling my stomach drop out of the eeriness of him staring at me. Then the man yelled through the glass, asking me a question, but I was too out of it to understand him.
"What?"
I said, walking closer to the window. The man repeated himself, asking me if I was someone he knew, named Jake or Jack or something. I didn't catch the name, but it definitely wasn't me. I shook my head no, and the man said nothing as he walked away from the window and disappeared past my front yard. Being a bit shaken, I immediately shut the blinds, then went back to the computer and told my friends about what just happened. They all didn't even believe me at first, but I think they heard the shakiness in my voice as they started asking a lot of questions, which only made me even more creeped out. I took their advice, going around and making sure all the doors were locked, then also locking the windows, which I'd never even bothered to do before. Then they assured me everything was okay, and we got back to what we were doing. A couple hours passed, and honestly, I'd completely forgotten about what had happened. I think I assumed that if they were to do something, it would have been right after he'd shown up. But then a loud knock from behind me almost shook me off my chair. This time, it was definitely from the front door. I told my friends, whispering into the headset. They said to see who it was and just call the cops. Doing as they said, I quietly walked over to the door and looked out onto the porch. It was him again, standing there and waiting for me to answer. I watched for a minute, and oddly, he kept looking to his right, as if he were looking at something or someone. I backed away and got my phone, calling the cops and whispering to them what was going on. Another knock came as I made my way back to the door and looked out, seeing the man looking off to the side again. Then he made a small gesture with his hand before knocking one more time, but the night was quiet enough for me to hear someone else's footsteps moving around to the side of the house. I followed the sound with my eyes until it stopped right under one of the windows. I saw the glass shift up slightly before getting stuck on the lock and falling back down. They tried again, but the window didn't give in. After this, there was probably a whole minute that went by where I didn't hear anything. I just stood there and listened to the operator updating me on the arrival of the officer as I stared at the window. A loud, dull sound came from outside the window, like something being wedged into the wood. I could see the entire frame around the glass moving as I backed away and tried to think of what to do. But suddenly, a set of footsteps ran from the front door to the side window, followed by both of them running away. Only a moment later, I saw the flashing red and blue lights coming through the windows. As for what happened afterwards, there wasn't much. Police had nothing to really go off of. I gave them a detailed description of one of the men, but that just wasn't enough. However, it's been over a year since that night, and there's been no signs of them having ever come back.
There are Dunkin' Donut shops everywhere here out east. They seem to be at just about every street corner. Personally, I've always liked their coffee, and I go there all the time. But something happened the last time I went there. It was the morning, and I was on my way to work. I don't get coffee every day on the way to work, but just here and there. When I do, most of the time, I go to this one Dunkin' Donut store that's on the way. I remember that I pulled into the parking lot and parked. Then I went inside. It was decently busy with a lot of other people in there. I got in line and then ordered within probably a minute or two. After getting my coffee, I left the store and walked back out into the parking lot. Now, I had been inside the Dunkin' for less than 5 minutes, but when I got back towards my car in the parking lot, I saw that there was a man standing around next to it. This was weird because I wasn't even parked like right next to the building, but sort of far away. I walked closer to my car, wondering who this guy was and what he was doing. I didn't get a great look at him because he wasn't exactly facing me. He appeared to be about average height though, and was wearing a black jacket. He was also standing on the passenger side of my car, and when I got closer, it looked like he might have been on the phone. But there were no cars parked directly next to mine on either side, so this was weird. Finally, I made it to my car and I hit the unlock button. My plan was to just ignore the guy and then drive away. I got inside my car, sat down, and started the engine. But as soon as I did, the passenger side door opened up. I saw the man get in and sit down right next to me in my own car. I was shocked at what was happening. After the guy sat down, I looked over at him and asked him what he was doing. He was not looking at me, but instead looking out of the window. He said nothing. Then, after a few seconds, I said to him, "I think you're in the wrong car." He still said nothing. After a couple more seconds, I told him to get out of my car. The guy was still ignoring me, and I couldn't believe it. I said to the guy that if he didn't leave, I was going to call the cops. At first, he still didn't do anything, but several seconds after that, he suddenly turned. It was very fast, and when he did, he reached for my keys, which were in the ignition. I was a little bit slow to react, but I tried to stop him. I grabbed his arm, but then he grabbed my arm with his other hand. We briefly struggled, but then he was able to pull the keys away from me. Following this, the man actually took a swing at me with the keys, using them as a weapon. With nothing to defend myself, I reached for the driver's door and I got out. Then I ran away from the car and I got my phone to call the police. I made it back inside of the Dunkin' store and then let police know what was going on. As this was happening, I saw my car leaving the parking lot with the man behind the wheel. He had stolen my car. The police got there about 10 minutes later and I filled out a report. I also had to call my work and let them know of the situation. Luckily, they understood and allowed me to take the day off. This could have been a huge headache for me, but the man who stole my car was caught later that same day. Apparently, he was driving recklessly, speeding and swerving between lanes. The police briefly chased him, and he eventually pulled over only to ditch the car and flee into the woods on foot. I was so happy that my car didn't have any damage. I got it back, but I've not gone back to that Dunkin' since. This story happened several years ago. During this time, I worked at a Dunkin' Donuts. I was part-time and got all kinds of different hours. We closed at 9 p.m., and on this particular night, I was working until close. This is something that I did all the time, and I didn't mind. Usually, the shop would be really quiet at night. Far more people seemed to get donuts and coffee in the morning. Still, sometimes it would surprise me and we would be busy. That wasn't the case for this night in particular. I was working by myself, but that wasn't supposed to be the case. My coworker didn't show up and didn't call in either, but I was fine with working alone and knew that I could handle it. I figured that things wouldn't be too busy at all. When I started, some customers came in here and there and ordered stuff. The inside of our shop was a little bit larger than most Dunkin's. There was a couple of booths and some other tables around. Sometimes people would come in and work on their laptops or whatever. This night, I didn't notice that, and the place seemed empty. For the last hour and a half, we didn't get a single customer. Then, finally, at 9 o'clock, we closed. I walked around the lobby just to make sure that everything was in order. But when I did, I passed by a booth and saw that a guy was on the floor. He was crouched down, and it was like he was hiding. He was in a location that would be impossible to see from behind the counter. I saw him looking at me as I spotted him, and it was really awkward. I asked him if he was all right. Clearly he was. The man didn't move for a second. Then he got out from his cramped hiding place. He stood up and then said that he was fine. The man was average height, thin, and had kind of messy hair. I told him that we were closed now and he would have to go. He said okay, and then took a couple of steps towards the door. But then he suddenly turned and began sprinting. It all happened so fast, but he wasn't sprinting for the door, and instead went for the counter. He then went behind the counter and appeared to go after our cash register. When I realized what he was doing, I headed for the exit to leave. I wanted to just get out of there and call the cops. As I was walking towards the door, the man suddenly shouted at me to stop. He said that I couldn't leave and told me to stay and go over to him. By now, I was standing in the lobby, probably about 30 feet from the door and 40 feet from the man. I didn't move. I wasn't sure if this guy had some kind of weapon on him or something, but I also certainly didn't want to go over to him. I just ran for it, going towards the exit. As I did, I heard him screaming at me to stop. Then, he started to run after me, but I kept going, and I made it to the exit, opened up the door, and ran out of there. I didn't think that the guy would leave after me. I figured he was trying to rob us, and with me gone, he'd stay in there, get his loot, and then flee. But that wasn't the case. He kept running after me, even leaving the building. Now we were both outside, and I was running through the parking lot. There were several other businesses very close by, but most of them appeared to be closed at this hour. I just wanted to go to the nearest open place, go inside, and tell everybody to call the police. If I was by other people, it would make me feel safer. So after running out of the Dunkin' parking lot, I was in a Jimmy John's parking lot, but they were closed. I kept running with the man chasing after me a ways back. I spotted a gas station up ahead that looked to be open. I was running as fast as I could. Soon I made it there and went inside. Then I yelled for everybody that could hear me to call the police. I only saw an employee behind the counter and one customer inside. Then I ran to the back of the gas station and went into the bathroom. When I made it in there, I locked the door and called the cops. Then I waited for them to arrive. I didn't hear the man inside the gas station or anything. When the police got there, he was gone. We went back to the Dunkin', and I finished talking to the police, as well as giving them the surveillance video. They said that they would look for the suspect, and I locked up the store and left. After that, I never heard anything more about it. I also only worked at Dunkin' for about another month. Luckily, I never saw or heard from that guy again. I used to work overnights at a 24-hour Dunkin'. I'm not sure whose idea it was for us to be open 24 hours, but nobody ever came in late at night. At least, not to the location that I worked at. It was actually kind of nice though, because I never really had to do that much work. By the time I left, the morning employees would be there. They would take care of the busy time in the morning. That's when everybody would be getting coffee and stuff before work. But I didn't have to worry about that. I would just help the few people that got coffee in the late night and overnight hours. One night, I was working, and obviously by myself. I think that it was about 2 o'clock in the morning at this time. We hadn't had any customers in a while. I was just chilling behind the counter, sort of in the back. I remember hearing the door open, so I moved closer to the counter to see who was there. I expected a customer to come up and order something, but instead, the first thing I saw was a man walking through the lobby and sit down at a table. The guy never faced me and was looking in the opposite direction the whole time, so I didn't really see his face at all. He was also wearing a sweatshirt with a hood and was looking down. He then sat down at a table, facing completely away from me. I found this behavior to be slightly suspicious, but still, I wasn't going to freak out or anything. I stood there for about a minute in case he got up to order something, but he stayed there. I couldn't tell if he was on his phone or something. That's what I assumed he was doing, because he was just looking down at the table, it appeared. When it became apparent that he probably wasn't going to get up and order something, I moved away. I went a little bit more into the back where I could chill and go on my phone or whatever. I couldn't really see much of out in the lobby from there, but I could see part of it. For example, I could basically just see the register and where people would order, as well as part of the donut case. I was back there for probably like 10 minutes. I didn't see or hear anything, so I assumed that the man was still just sitting there. I got up to walk back over to the counter. As soon as I got back out, I saw the man standing there. He was to the right of where you order, but right in front of the counter. He was facing me, except I saw that he had very long hair, and it was coming down in front of his face. It was a very creepy sight. I could barely see any part of his actual face because of it. Was he trying to scare me or something? I walked over to him and asked if I could help. Instead of ordering something, or even answering me, the man then jumped over the counter. I quickly moved to the side and away from him. Now that he was on the employees only side of the counter, he started running over to me. When he got close, he reached out to grab me. I moved away just on time though, and I ran for the door and left the building. The man did not chase me outside and remained in there. So I went for my car, which was the only vehicle in the parking lot. I got inside, locked the doors, and then called the police. Then I waited in my car for them to arrive. If the man came out and chased after me at any point, I would be able to drive away. Luckily, he didn't. The police got there a short time later and then entered the building. They found the man crouched down behind the counter. When he was located, the guy tried fighting off the officers before he was eventually arrested. I think that he was under the influence of drugs, and that was to blame for his crazy behavior. After this experience, I wanted to get off the night shift as soon as possible. It took 2 weeks, but I was soon able to. Not long after that, I quit Dunkin' and moved on. That was by far the scariest thing that happened while I worked there. I used to go to Dunkin' almost every morning on my way to work. It was a routine for me to stop, go inside, pick up my coffee, and then go to work. I'm honestly lazy in the morning, and I don't feel like making my own coffee. Plus, it doesn't taste that good when I make it. I know I could save lots of money or whatever, but I just don't care. There are Dunkins all over the place near where I live. I probably pass by 3 or 4 alone on my drive to work every day. But there was one in particular that I would usually go to. It was just the most convenient. With all of the factors such as parking lot and in and out from the highway, I liked it the best. So I got there one day and went inside to order. Usually it was pretty busy at this time in the morning, So after I ordered, I was standing there near a couple of other people and waiting for the coffee. In that time, this guy that was next to me started talking to me. He said that he saw me there all the time, and I said yes, I go there a lot. I didn't recognize him, but I never pay close attention to the other customers. I'm always tired and haven't had my coffee yet. So the guy started talking to me, asking me where I'm from and where I work and stuff like that. I was talking to him, but he seemed a little bit strange. Then he asked me for my number. I didn't want to give it to him, and I declined. At about that same time, my coffee was done. I picked it up and then left. Now, fast forward to the next day. I went to Dunkin' again to get coffee like usual. I ordered and was waiting in the same spot, and the same guy came up and approached me. I was disappointed to see him there again. He said it was a crazy coincidence to see me here. He then tried asking me to hang out with him and convincing me to give him my number, but I kept saying no. He was being really insistent about it. The situation was frustrating. I did not want to give him my number. When my coffee was done, I picked it up. The guy sort of walked next to me, and as I went to leave, I turned and told him that I was not going to this Dunkin' ever again. Then I walked out. But when I left the building, the man did as well. I turned and told him not to follow me. The guy said that he wasn't. I walked out to my car, and luckily did not see the man following me. But as soon as I pulled back onto the road to drive away, I saw a car pull out behind me. I looked in my mirror and saw that the same man was driving. I hoped this didn't mean he was going to follow me, but unfortunately he did. After leaving Dunkin' and driving down one road, I then merged onto the highway and he was still there. I drove the entire rest of the way to my job. It took about 15 minutes, and he was still following me when I pulled into the property. I was worried, but I always parked in a secure area where I had to show my ID to get into it. So I was able to get through, and obviously the guy wasn't able to. He stayed in the parking lot area that wasn't restricted. I figured he would leave after that, and I felt better. I went through the normal workday and then left at about 5 o'clock. When I did, after leaving the parking lot and going back onto the road, a car pulled out behind me. Soon, I realized that it was the same guy. I don't know if he waited there all day for me, or if he came back knowing that I would be done with work. Either way, he was following me again. I started driving home, but he followed wherever I went. Every turn that I made, he did. Soon, I was getting close to where I lived. Instead of driving home, I went back onto the highway. I wasn't really sure where I was going, but I certainly wasn't leading this guy to my house. I drove along the highway and then took an exit and drove around some more. I started just driving around that area of town for a while. Traffic was sort of bad at this hour. I was able to go in a sort of busy street and actually get a car or two between us. Then I changed lanes a couple of times and went through a yellow light. The car behind me stopped, which trapped the guy at the light. Really, I just got lucky. I realized that I had made it away from him, and then I headed for home. I was able to make it back safely. After that happened, I obviously did not go back to that Dunkin'. I work at Dunkin', and this is something that happened several months ago. I've had the job for almost a year. The location that I work at doesn't seem to be that busy most of the time. I guess it's not in the most populated area, but we do get a good amount of people during the morning rush. That's when a lot of people stop by for coffee and donuts. But other than that, we're pretty quiet for much of the day. On the day of this story, I was working a shift that started in the morning and ended in the late afternoon. So when I got there, I think about 10 a.m., we were somewhat busy. The busiest time of the day had passed, but I was working with 2 other coworkers. Shortly after I got there, one of them left, and by 2 p.m. I would be all by myself. Now, I would say at around 1 p.m., I was standing behind the counter and no customers were inside. Then a man walked in. He was a larger guy with blondish colored hair and a bit of a beard which was the same color. After entering, he walked up to the counter right in front of me. I said hi, and the man said that he would have an everything bagel with cream cheese. Unfortunately, we had run out of everything bagels that day. We likely wouldn't have any more until the next morning. After I told the man we didn't have any everything bagels, I thought maybe he would order something else. Instead, he just said okay and walked out. Now, about an hour went by. We got a couple customers in that time, but not many. Then the same man walked in. When I realized it was him again, I found it a little bit interesting. He walked up to the counter once more and ordered the same thing as before. I told him we still didn't have any of that kind of bagel. Without saying a word or even showing any kind of emotion, he just left again. Now I found this to be strange. I didn't really know what this guy's situation was, but it only gets weirder. About 30 minutes after that, the man came back. The same as the first 2 times, he walked in and approached me at the counter. He asked for an everything bagel again. I told him we still didn't have any and wouldn't for the rest of the day. Then I asked him why he kept coming in here and ordering it. The man denied ever being in here before. He said this was his first time. I thought that he was joking, even though he wasn't smiling and actually seemed serious. I told him that he was here 2 times before and ordered the same thing, but he claimed that he wasn't here. I was telling him how he had come before and stuff, but as I was talking, he just walked out and left the place again, completely ignoring me. I thought that it was really strange. By that time, I was just working by myself. We really weren't that busy anymore at all. So I kept working and things were slow as expected. For the next probably hour or so, we had only maybe 3 or 4 people come in. Then the man returned. This time though, I spotted him at a window. Like many Dunkins, we have some large windows so you can see a lot of outside. I just remember noticing the man standing outside of the window and just looking in. He put his hands up against the glass and moved his face really close. He was just staring in with wide eyes. It was really creepy, to be honest. He just kept staring in, and after a while, I waved at him. Nothing happened though, and he didn't move. This went on for the longest time. I thought about going outside, but decided not to. As time went on, the expression on his face seemed to get angrier and angrier. Eventually, after about 10 minutes, he finally walked away. I tried to see where he was going, if he drove here or what, but he just walked around the building out of my sight. It seemed as though he went into another property nearby after that. I was so weirded out by the whole thing. I still don't know what happened. Since that day, I haven't seen the man.
It was a Friday night, back in 2018. I was working at home on a paper I needed to finish for work, and was trying to get it done so I could enjoy my weekend without having to worry about it. It was probably somewhere around 10 at this point, but I'd been working in my office for a good 3 hours. This was after a full day already too, so I was getting pretty exhausted. I kept finding myself getting distracted or losing focus, so I paused what I was doing and stood up to stretch my legs and try to wake myself up. I paced around the room a bit, but as I passed by the wall opposite of my desk, I noticed something move in the window. I stopped and did a double take, looking out the window again. I was on the 2nd story of my house, but the window has a view of the front portion of the property by the garage and porch. At first, I didn't see anything and thought my mind was playing tricks on me, but then I saw a bit of movement again. It was a shadow hovering over the sidewalk leading up to the porch. Someone was standing outside the front door, or at least that's what it looked like from the shadow. After looking out the window for a couple minutes and seeing the shadow barely move, I left my office and went downstairs. I leaned on the front door and looked out the peephole. There was a man, looking about 40 years old and bald, with a scruffy gray beard. I watched for a moment. He never knocked or rang the doorbell, or made any noise at all. He just stood there. What started freaking me out more was that I didn't know how long he'd been there for, since I was working and never noticed him until just a couple minutes ago. Wanting some answers to why the man was here, I opened the door. Immediately, I was taken aback because the man didn't even flinch. His face stayed the same, being cold and lacking emotion.
"What are you doing here?"
I said in a stern tone. The man continued to look at me, but didn't answer. Then his eyes moved past me and looked down the hallway in my home. I moved the door further in toward my body to hide the view.
"I don't know why you're here, but you need to leave,"
I said, closing the door firmly. His strange behavior was both creepy and aggravating. Him ignoring me and just standing there made me really frustrated. But then I heard his footsteps begin walking off the porch and away from the house. I sighed in relief and checked to be sure he'd gone away, then went back up to my office. Trying to forget about the man and focus back on my work, I continued where I left off. About 5 minutes later, and just as I was beginning to really start working, a sudden knock echoed through the house. It was from the front door, but the knocks were loud, like someone banging on the door with their whole fist. Irritated, I got up and quickly ran down to the front door, swinging it open aggressively with the intent to yell at the man. But when I saw him, I quickly changed my mind. Something about the look in his eyes and the way he was standing instantly shifted my anger into fear. I looked down at his hands, seeing him holding something to his side, like he was trying to conceal it from me. All I could make out was the top of a small handle, resembling that of a knife. I looked back up at him, only to see his whole body jolt toward me. I jumped back and slammed the door shut, then fought to lock it as the man was trying to turn the handle from the other side. Once I got the handle and the bolt lock latched, the man started banging on the door again for several seconds before running away. I stood there with barely any breath in me, feeling my adrenaline still surging through my body. Shakily, I went to the office and called 911. The man was never seen after that, and no real answers to what happened that night were ever found. Last winter, I went on a trip to see a few of my friends from college. The drive was 18 hours, so I did it in 2 9-ish hour sections, staying at an Airbnb on the way there. It was the same thing on the way back, but I'd booked a different Airbnb just for fun, I guess. I thought it would be nice to see some different areas and whatnot. Anyway, a bit of heavy snow caused some delays, and I didn't get to the town until 9 p.m. It was a very small area, which I was already aware of because there were pretty much no big towns or cities at the halfway point of the 18-hour drive. The last Airbnb was in a small town as well, but this one was noticeably much smaller. A few stores bordered the road, but all the houses were either on farms or just really far apart. When I got to my Airbnb, it was no different, being pretty far from other houses. However, the outside was somewhat modernized. It clearly had some cabin-style features, but it almost looked out of place compared to all the other houses I could see. I parked on the gravel driveway and went up to the door, putting in the code and going inside the house. I'd seen the pictures of the inside online, and it looked about the same. I went around and checked out all the rooms, then put my things in the bedroom and went out to the couch. As soon as I sat down and picked up the remote, I heard a tapping noise from right behind me. I quickly turned my head, seeing a woman outside the window tapping on the glass. Her hair was unkempt and long, and she had a crazy sort of look in her eyes. Once she got my attention though, she pointed toward the front door and walked away from the window. I got up, still with my heart racing from the unexpectedness of it, and made my way to the door. Knowing it was just some old lady, I didn't exactly feel scared, but I was definitely not feeling safe either. I cracked the door just enough to talk to her. She smiled and said she needed help. I waited for a second for her to explain, but after a moment, I asked what she needed help with. She looked behind her, saying she lost something in the road just outside the house. I looked out, not being able to see anything past the lowly lights of the Airbnb.
I'm not really sure I can help with that,
I said. Her smile left her face, and then she repeated herself, like the whole thing about her losing something on the road, repeating it almost word for word.
Yeah, I know. I don't think I can help. Sorry.
I said again, closing the door. I waited for a minute until I could hear her leave, then I went back to the couch. I wasn't sure if she was just some crazy lady or if there was something else going on, but it was just a very strange way to be introduced to the town. I relaxed and turned on the TV, watching some shows until 11 when I got in bed. I think I still felt a bit uncomfortable because I found it difficult to fall asleep. All I remember is laying in bed restless for a whole hour, then abruptly waking up sometime in the middle of the night. There was a sound coming from the front of the house. It was quiet, but with the rest of the house being silent, it stood out. My mind immediately went to the lady from earlier as I got up from the bed and nervously walked down the hallway and looked at where I was hearing it from. The front door. I rushed over to stop them, but the door opened just as I got my body against it. I pressed all my weight into the door as whoever was on the other side seemed to do the same. I'm a pretty big guy, so whoever it was out there had to be big too, because for a moment it felt like they might actually overpower me and get the door open, but they gave up after a few seconds of pushing and sprinted down the driveway. I locked the door and ran to the window, trying to get a view of who they were, but they were already past the light. I thought through my options for a second, then ran to grab my things from the bedroom and went out to my car, driving away. I didn't want to be at that house any longer, and I knew police in a small town like that wouldn't be all that helpful. I don't know who was behind that door, but I'm sure they had to have been with the woman from earlier that night. If I had went out to help her, or if I had woken up even a second later, I don't think I would have been seen again after that night. I was out camping in Colorado a few years ago during fall. This camping trip was an impulse decision, as I just felt like going out for the night and spending it in the calming nature. I had walked down a 2-hour trail that led to the spot I set up at. It wasn't a big campground like all the other places were. This was a small opening at the end of a dirt path that I'd found a couple years back, and nobody else ever seemed to come here. The forest around the opening was really nice too, and over the years I've gotten used to navigating it without getting lost. On this day, just an hour or so before sunset, I set out on a short walk around the area. Going for walks around this time is always the best, being that the woods are calm and the breeze starts to set in. I walked out and around for maybe 20 minutes before I saw something ahead. A man, walking in the woods just like me. He was crossing in front of me about 60 yards out, so pretty far, and he didn't look like he noticed I was there. But what was odd was the way he was walking. He was motioning his hands around and nodding his head, and although I couldn't hear him, I could see his mouth moving like he was talking. I waited to see if maybe someone was following behind him, but no, it was just him talking to himself. Maybe it wasn't something to get overly creeped out on, but I'd never seen anyone out here before, and the man didn't exactly look normal. After a minute though, he was gone. I turned around and went back to my tent, not really feeling comfortable being out in the woods with that guy wandering around. I waited a half hour, then got a campfire going as the sun was now set. I had a folded chair I was sitting on, and I mostly just thought to myself for the next hour. Not about anything particular, but more in a way to clear my mind. Then, about 2 hours past sunset, I heard something in the distance. I moved away from the crackling fire and toward the trees so I could hear better. It was someone talking, or mumbling, far out in the woods. Even stranger though, I didn't see a flashlight or any source of light. He was walking out there in the pitch black. My stomach dropped, knowing it was extremely unlikely that the man from earlier could have just stumbled upon my campsite by accident. I stayed and listened, hoping that by some chance he didn't know I was here and was just passing by. 30 seconds later, the voice faded out. I wasn't fully convinced this was all just chance though. I covered most of the fire, leaving only a small flame burning so it wouldn't create too much light. Then I waited and listened. The next hour was unnerving to say the least. I didn't hear or see anything, but it was the anticipation that kept me feeling uneasy. And then, at what had to be 11 p.m. by now, footsteps came rushing from directly in front of my campfire. I shot up from my chair and unholstered my pistol as a man I recognized as the one from earlier ran up to the other side of the fire and stopped just 10 feet from me. He wasn't talking anymore, but instead had a grin. Not an over-the-top smile, but just a slight, friendly grin. As I aimed at him, he said nothing and did nothing. He just looked at me.
Walk away, right now,
I said under my breath, trying to be as intimidating as possible. He looked me in the eyes, then down at my gun, and then back at me. His grin went away, and there was a moment where it felt like he was just about to do something. But then he smiled again and walked off into the woods. I didn't waste any time, packing things up with one hand as I kept my pistol out, then left in the opposite direction from where he went. The whole way back, I was so paranoid that I kept thinking I was hearing the man's voice, talking to himself again. What he was doing out there, and what he was trying to do to me, is anyone's best guess. Had I not been prepared though, I don't think I would have been able to leave those woods. Not more than a week or two ago, I hiked out on a long trail in the dense woods behind my town. I lived in a really close-knit town with just under 1,000 people, so we were pretty far out from any big populated cities. The woods on the outskirts were very flat, no mountains or hills, but had a few ponds and some small rivers running through the middle. I was heading to one of these rivers. I'd been there before a few times, though I'd never had the chance to camp there until this day. As I could recall from the previous times, I knew it was about a 3-hour walk, almost perfectly north. As I walked between the trees, it was very quiet, aside from birds and other animals rustling the leaves around me. There were no people or hikers, and I didn't plan to see anyone because this was not even a trail, it was just open woods. But as I was just 45 minutes out from the river, I ran into someone. We were both walking toward each other, and it seemed like neither of us had noticed the other until we were just a few feet away, separated by only a couple trees. I know I had a confused and almost nervous look, finding it really unusual to run into someone off trail in the middle of these woods, but the man had the same look. I was about to break the silence and say hello, but after a second, his face shifted into a slight nervous smile and he turned to walk off to the side. I followed his lead and kept on walking as well, but I looked back once I got a little further away and saw the man was no longer walking, but almost running away. Not saying a word when running into each other, gave me a somewhat unsettled feeling, but seeing him run off like that only made it even stranger. It was like the man did not want to be seen, or he didn't care about the almost impossible chance that we had run into each other. Whatever the case, I kept minding my own business and made my way to the river. This was no campsite or anything, so I just plopped my bag and tent down on the flattest area I could find. Then I got a fire going, since the sun was just about to set. I tossed in a bunch of random sticks and twigs that were around and made sure it would burn for a couple hours at least. I was hoping to stay up and wait until the stars came out so I could do some stargazing. Away from town, I can often get a good view of the Milky Way, which is a sight I never want to miss out on. Hours passed while I was sitting and waiting, until a distinct sound came through the quiet woods behind me. Footsteps, slow and careful ones. I turned and looked, not seeing much in the dark. As I gazed around though, the footsteps stopped, telling me that while I may not see them, they can see me. I reached down for my bag and picked up a heavy-duty flashlight, shining it at the trees. I could see decently far now, but as I moved it back and forth, I didn't see anyone. I felt my heart rate increasing a bit as the unsettling feeling came over me again.
Anyone out there?
I tried again.
Hello?
Not even the sound of another footstep. After a moment of contemplation, I started to walk toward where I'd heard the sound from. I thought maybe there was a chance I was mistaken, but I needed to be sure. I carefully stepped through the woods, keeping the flashlight steadily pointing ahead until I got to where I thought the sound was from. I moved the light to my left, looking behind each tree, until the light suddenly revealed a large man. It was the one I'd run into only a few hours ago. He was no more than 20 feet away, but even with the light on him, he stood still. In an act of quick thinking, I tried to not react and continued to move my flashlight across the woods, hoping he would think that I somehow didn't see him. Then I began walking back to the tent, trying to act as unbothered as possible. I picked up my bag and looked around once more, before quickly leaving my tent and campfire behind and walking into the woods along the riverside. Once I felt I'd made enough distance, I sprinted as far as I could until I was without a doubt away from that man. I found a spot to rest at and sat there awake until sunrise. I don't think I was followed, as I was able to make it out without ever hearing or seeing that man again. I'm not sure why he was out there, or why he had shown up and hid by my campsite, but I never went back to retrieve my tent, in fear that I might find out.
This was back in 2015 or 2016. I'm a career tow truck driver, and at this point I've been towing cars for most of my adult life, and I will likely do so until I either retire or die, whichever comes first. At the time, I was working for a pretty small towing company with only 2 employees, and we rotated who was on call each weekend. It was my weekend on call, and it was summer, so with people being out and about late and whatnot, I was pretty busy. Cleaning up accidents, towing broken down cars, both in the city and off the highway. I was fine with it, as I was paid commission at the time, so the more calls I did, the more money I made. It was a Saturday night, now Sunday morning, and it's around 2:30 to 3 o'clock in the morning. And like I said, I've been busy. I'm tired and a little grumpy, and I kind of just wanted to go home when my phone rings. It's an insurance company asking if we can do a tow for one of their customers who was broken down on the side of the highway. The breakdown location they give me is about 15 miles out of town, which I normally wouldn't do, but the tow destination happens to be a dealership that's only a couple minutes away from my apartment. I contemplated rejecting the call, but because I'm paid commission, I figured screw it. I can run up and grab this car, drop it off around the corner from my place, and hopefully I can just head home and get a couple hours of shut-eye. So I take the call and I hop on the highway. The insurance company provided me with the customer's first name, which we'll say was Kara, and gave me a phone number for her. Usually I try to make contact with people who are on the side of the highway to let them know I'm on my way and give them an ETA. I tried calling her a couple of times, but she didn't answer. Not unusual though. After a short while, I see hazard lights up the way on the shoulder, so I turn on my strobes and start slowing down. As I approach, I notice that not only is there the late model car that I'm looking for, but there's another car on scene as well that doesn't have its hazards on, and is parked in front of the car I'm meant to tow. This can be kind of annoying but not uncommon, as I need to be able to get in front of the disabled car in order to load it, and sometimes people don't realize that. But because the car is there, I instead pull up behind both cars. You're supposed to do this so that as the tow driver, you're the one that has to make the weird maneuver of pulling off the shoulder and back onto the shoulder, and so the other car just has to drive straight forward on the shoulder. Standing at the trunk of the late model car, which is now directly in front of me, is a man and a woman. The woman is probably in her early 20s and dressed up for a night out. She's probably about 5'1", maybe 5'2", and she's wearing tight leather pants, a halter top, long black hair, and is very pretty. The man, on the other hand, is probably around 5'10" and skinny, maybe 150 pounds, wearing a dark hoodie and dirty jeans. They're standing very close facing each other. She has her arms crossed and he's leaning down talking to her. I stepped out of my truck and approached them both and introduced myself. They separate a few feet and I look at the woman and say, "Are you Kara?" And she nods. I say I'm here for an insurance company and I ask what's going on with the car. Pretty much immediately the man pipes up and says, "Yeah, it's just having some fuel issues. It's an easy fix. Can you please just drop it off at this commuter parking lot? I'm gonna fix it up for her." I'm rather annoyed at this because the commuter lot in question is further up the highway and I'm already 15 miles out of town. Like I said before, I only took this call because it was supposed to be coming back toward my apartment and I really wanted to go home. Not only that, but in order to change the original tow destination, I would have to call the insurance company and wait on hold for who knows how long for a representative, and then let them know of the change and try to get them to pay me extra for the dead miles back home after unloading. And I really didn't want to do any of that. And thirdly, this is a late model car. I'm no mechanic, but it's new enough that whatever is wrong with it is likely covered under warranty, so the dealership is really the best place for it to go anyways. I explained all of this to the guy, but he's really not having it. He starts to get stern with me, saying something like, "Look man, you just need to take the car where I tell you to take it." We go back and forth on this for maybe 60 seconds and he's just getting more mad. "Well, you know what, man? You're not the name insured. Kara is. The easy way to settle this is to ask what she wants me to do with the car, and whatever she says is what I'll do. Fingers crossed she'll want to take it to the dealership so I can get home sooner." So I turn to look at Kara to ask her that question, and I don't see her right away. She's no longer standing where she was just a minute ago, which was slightly off to my right. I continue to not see her until I've turned almost all the way around, because she's standing directly behind me. And by directly, I mean within an inch of my back, arms still crossed. I look down at her and she locks eyes with me. Her eyes were as wide as plates, almost owl-like. And immediately, it feels like she's staring into my soul. She didn't say a word, and she didn't have to. I took a step back and did what felt like a double take. I looked at him, then at her, then at him again, and then back at her. And it slowly started to dawn on me that maybe something isn't right. I asked her, "Do you know this guy?" And she ever so slightly shook her head no. The expression on her face when I asked her that will forever be burned in my skull. I turned to the guy and was like, "Oh, you gotta go, man." Now, I'm not gonna say I'm a tough guy, if there is such thing, and I don't care who knows it. I've got nothing to prove. I'm also super averse to confrontation, and I will run at the first sight of trouble. I'm not exactly the biggest of guys either. I am, however, what I like to call sturdy. I'm 5'8" and 240 pounds. I have a bit of a gut, but I also have big thighs and broad shoulders, and people are generally surprised to find out that I weigh as much as I do. And I think that might have been my saving grace for what happened next. Without a word, the guy starts to move for Kara, and I move to stay in between them. He tries to push me out of his way by shoving me in the chest, but because I believe he underestimated my weight, he only pushed me hard enough to make me take a single step back. Immediately, I took that step forward towards him and body checked him hard. hard as I could. Hard enough to completely knock him over, basically onto his ass. Because we rotated during the back and forth push bit, Kara is now in front of me to my right, somewhat between me and the guy who's trying to scramble to his feet. I reached out and snatched the poor girl up by her waist and spun her towards my truck and yelled for her to get into the driver's side, and she does. I turn back to the guy who's standing up again at this point, and he's breathing hard. He gets right up in my face but doesn't do anything, just breathes at me. I stare him right in his face and, mustering up the best dad voice I can, I just say, "You need to go." I'm shaking now and I'm absolutely terrified. Had no clue if he had a weapon, and I didn't know if he was going to try to fight me, and I don't know what I would do if he did. Like I said, I don't really consider myself a tough guy. I don't know how to fight, and I've never been in a fight in my life. What if I get badly hurt? What if I get stabbed? What the hell do I do now? I just want to go home. I wasn't even going to take this damn call. All this is running through my head at lightning speed. After probably around 15 seconds or so, which felt like eons, he kinda huffs a bit and smiles one of the creepiest smiles I've ever seen, and finally starts to back off. Sucking his teeth and rubbing his hands together, he slowly walks backwards a few steps, then makes his way to his car and gets in and drives off. I stay motionless, watching him until I could no longer see his taillights. I got Kara's car loaded up on the tow truck, and as we made our way to the dealership, she told me through tears that her car had shut off while she was driving. She pulled onto the shoulder and called her parents, because she was on their insurance. Her parents made the call to the insurance company, who eventually dispatched me to her location. While she was waiting, a bit after she made the call, the guy pulled up in front of her and walked up to her passenger side window to try to talk to her, asking if she needed help, etc. She told him she was fine, that a tow truck was coming and she didn't need any help. But he persisted, and she tried to tell him off. Eventually, she tried to roll up the window. Apparently, he was able to stick his arm in the window and got the door unlocked and opened the door. So in fear, she jumped out of the car, leaving her phone inside, and ran to the back of her car and stayed put there, because it was in the line of sight of traffic. Apparently, he was pretty lewd with her, and whenever she tried to go back to the car, he would prevent her from getting in. Several minutes later, I showed up. Who knows what would have happened had the timing been any different. Her parents were waiting at the dealership when we arrived, and she told them what had just happened. Her parents also gave me a $20 tip, which was all the cash they had on them at the time, and Kara gave me a very tight and clearly heartfelt hug before I left. I never saw her again. I tell you what, every guy has probably daydreamed at some point of coming to the rescue of a beautiful girl in trouble, myself included. You think you're going to act like a superhero, that you're going to be the cat's ass. But for me, being in that situation, in that moment, was one of the most terrible feelings I've ever had in my life. Being forced into a confrontation I didn't want nor was prepared for, not knowing what to expect from a clearly not well unhinged individual. I didn't feel like the cat's ass, and I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like a scared little kid encountering a bully on the playground for the first time. If I'm ever in a situation like that, I will never not intervene though. I just really hope I don't have to.